So we've said goodbye to the orphan trains. The prairie is quiet, the echoes have faded, and now let's float somewhere very different: palaces, thrones, crowns. But don't get too excited, because as glamorous as European royalty sounds, tonight we are focusing on the weirdest, most tragic detail of all: how many kings and queens were basically their own cousins. Yes, we're talking about inbreeding. Because when you spend centuries marrying your nieces, nephews, and double first cousins just to keep the bloodline pure, you end up with heirs who look less like divine rulers and more like half-baked potatoes with very expensive jewelry. Let's start with the Habsburgs, because honestly, where else could we begin? The Habsburg dynasty ruled large parts of Europe for centuries: Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, bits of Italy, the Netherlands. Their motto might as well have been, "Why look outside the family when your cousin is right here?" The result, a family tree that's less of a tree and more of a tangled shrub, branches looping back into themselves, names repeating endlessly, and genetic material getting recycled like yesterday's soup. Their most famous genetic calling card was something historians politely call the Habsburg jaw. Picture this: a lower jaw so pronounced it looked like it was trying to escape the rest of the face. Thick lips, drooping chins, and difficulty chewing or even speaking. Generations of portraits show this same unfortunate chin marching through time, like a hereditary curse with very fancy collars. One of the worst cases belonged to Charles II of Spain, nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. Spoiler, it wasn't witchcraft, it was just centuries of uncle-niece marriages. Charles II was, by all accounts, a royal disaster. Born in 1661, he was the product of so much inbreeding that modern geneticists estimate his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been siblings, which, fun fact, they nearly were. He didn't learn to walk until age 8. He couldn't speak properly until much later. He suffered from seizures, physical disabilities, and constant illnesses. And perhaps most famously, he couldn't produce an heir, ending centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule. One court physician wrote that Charles had the constitution of a chicken, which, while not very scientific, feels about right. Imagine being the king of one of the richest empires in the world and still not being able to chew dinner without difficulty. That was Charles, the most powerful man in Spain, who lived his whole life as proof that too many cousin marriages will eventually catch up with you. But Charles wasn't alone. The Habsburgs had a long tradition of marrying close relatives. Ferdinand I married his cousin. Philip I married his niece. And that was considered normal, because why dilute the royal bloodline with fresh DNA when you can just recycle? The irony, of course, is that this obsession with purity didn't make the dynasty stronger. It made it weaker. By the late 1600s, the Spanish Habsburg line collapsed entirely, thanks to infertility, illness, and Charles II's inability to produce children. So in trying to preserve their power, they basically bred themselves out of existence, which is kind of the most Habsburg ending possible. Now, before we drift further into royal disasters, let's pause on something. The orphan train story showed us how children were uprooted and erased in America. Now we are watching the opposite problem: children born into too much family, too much expectation, and way too little genetic variety. Different continents, different problems, but both are bedtime stories about what happens when adults make very confident decisions about children's lives. And both, as you can hear, end up a little tragic, a little absurd, and oddly calming to listen to in the dark. But don't worry, the Habsburgs aren't our only royal mess. Next, we'll float over to England, where the Tudors, the Stuarts, and eventually even Queen Victoria got tangled in their own family webs. And then maybe to Russia, where the Romanovs had their share of genetic surprises too. Spoiler, hemophilia makes an appearance. because apparently royal families liked passing down medical conditions almost as much as they liked passing down crowns. So we've lingered with the Habsburgs and their jawline apocalypse. Now let's cross the channel and settle into England. Because if there's one thing the English monarchy loves almost as much as ceremony, it's a good dynastic tangle. First up, the Tudors. Everyone knows Henry VIII for his 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. You know the rhyme. But what often gets missed is why Henry was so obsessed with producing a son. It wasn't just vanity, it was genetic fear. The Tudors weren't exactly a robust dynasty. They came to power through war, not centuries of strong breeding. Their claim to the throne was wobbly at best, and Henry's own father, Henry VII, had built his line by marrying Elizabeth of York, basically stitching together 2 rival houses with one very strategic wedding. So when Henry VII couldn't get sons that survived, panic set in. His male children died in infancy. His daughters, well, they existed, but Henry wasn't exactly progressive about female succession. Here where it gets interesting. Historians now suspect Henry VII himself may have had a genetic disorder, possibly something like MacLeod syndrome or Kell blood group incompatibility, that caused miscarriages and stillbirths with his wives. In other words, the royal fertility crisis may have been less about the wives and more about Henry's own faulty DNA. Of course, he didn't see it that way. He blamed the women, which is very on brand for Henry. So while the Tudors weren't technically as inbred as the Habsburgs, they still left behind a trail of fragile heirs, miscarriages, and dynastic instability, all because their king might have had some questionable genes and a very short fuse. Now let's drift forward a little to the Stuarts. James I of England, who was also James VI of Scotland, married Anne of Denmark, not too scandalous on the surface, but the Stuart line had its own problems. For one, James himself may have carried genetic quirks. He was described as sickly, with weak legs, and had a reputation for being prone to fainting. His children weren't particularly robust either. Charles I, yes, the one who got his head chopped off, was short, had a stammer, and may have inherited some of those health issues. And then, of course, the Stuarts got tangled with the wider European dynasties, marrying into the French Bourbons and others, which meant they dipped into the same gene pool that was already being recycled by the Habsburgs. Not a good strategy if you want strong heirs. By the time we get to Mary, Queen of Scots, and her descendants, you can see the same pattern. Cousins marrying cousins, alliances that kept the family close, but not necessarily healthy. But the real crown jewel of royal genetic oddities: Queen Victoria and hemophilia. Now this is where it gets fascinating. Victoria herself was healthy enough. No Habsburg jaw, no major issues, but she carried a genetic mutation that caused hemophilia, a condition where blood doesn't clot properly, which, in the 19th century, was basically a death sentence from the smallest cut or bruise. Victoria passed this gene to several of her children, and because her children married into basically every royal family in Europe, the disease spread like gossip at a court banquet. Her son Leopold suffered terribly from it. He died at age 30 after a fall. 2 of her daughters carried the gene into Spain and Russia, which means the Spanish Bourbons and the Russian Romanovs both ended up with hemophiliac heirs. In fact, hemophilia became so associated with royalty that people nicknamed it the royal disease. And here, where history gets deliciously ironic, Queen Victoria's attempt to spread her dynasty across Europe by marrying her children into other royal families ended up spreading a genetic disorder that destabilized those very monarchies. For example, Tsar Nicholas II's only son, Alexei, had hemophilia. His constant illness and fragility were a huge source of anxiety in the Russian court. which opened the door for mystics like Rasputin to gain influence, because the desperate royal family thought he could heal the boy. So yes, if you trace it back far enough, Queen Victoria's genes helped create the conditions for the Russian Revolution. Imagine that, a single mutation in one queen's DNA rippled across empires, toppling thrones, all because royal matchmaking couldn't resist keeping things in the family. So between Henry VII's fertility drama, the Stuart weaknesses, and Victoria's haemophilia, the English monarchy wasn't exactly genetic perfection. They might not have had the Habsburg jaw, but they had plenty of their own bedtime disasters to pass down. And we're not done, because next we're floating east into Russia itself. The Romanovs, who had crowns, palaces, Fabergé eggs, and a fragile heir whose illness helped unravel an empire. But let's take a slow pause first. Breathe in, imagine candlelight flickering against gold walls, a child coughing in the background, and a mystic with a very suspicious beard whispering that everything will be fine. That's where we are heading. Alright, so we've traced Queen Victoria's haemophilia gene across Europe. Now it's time to see what happened when that gene landed in Russia, because this one child's illness quietly shook an empire. Meet Alexei Romanov. Born in 1904, son of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, the heir to the entire Russian Empire. You'd think that would come with the usual royal perks, palaces, jewels, tutors, all that. And yes, he had those, but what he didn't have was clotting blood. From the moment Alexei was born, it became clear something was wrong. A simple bruise would swell. A minor cut could keep bleeding far too long. He inherited haemophilia from his mother, Alexandra, who, of course, carried it from her grandmother, Queen Victoria. The Romanovs were devastated. In a monarchy, heirs aren't just children, they're the whole future of the dynasty. And here was the only male heir, fragile as glass. Now, haemophilia wasn't exactly a secret, but it was treated like one. The Romanovs kept Alexei's condition hidden from the public. Admitting the heir was sickly could destabilize the monarchy. And in a country already restless with revolution, weakness was not something the family could afford to show. So the boy grew up in a strange, sheltered bubble, protected, coddled, watched constantly. His every stumble was a crisis. His every fever felt like the end of the dynasty. And this is where Rasputin enters the scene. Grigory Rasputin. The man, the myth, the beard. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't really a priest either. More like a wandering mystic with questionable hygiene and a talent for persuasion. But Alexandra, desperate to help her son, became convinced Rasputin had healing powers. And to be fair, sometimes he seemed to. When Alexei was bleeding or feverish, Rasputin would pray by his side, and the boy would recover. Historians now suggest Rasputin may have simply calmed Alexandra, who then calmed the household. Or maybe Rasputin discouraged certain treatments, like aspirin, which actually made bleeding worse. Whatever the reason, Alexandra became convinced Rasputin was divinely chosen to protect her son. This gave Rasputin enormous influence in the Russian court. Ministers came and went at his word. Alexandra defended him against scandal after scandal, and the nobility began to panic. Because it wasn't just a sickly child anymore, it was a mystic with greasy hair and a hypnotic stare, whispering in the ear of the empress. Meanwhile, Nicholas II wasn't exactly helping. He was famously indecisive, a man better suited to a quiet country life than running a sprawling, unstable empire. But instead of dealing with Russia's mounting crises, he often withdrew. He leaned on Alexandra, who leaned on Rasputin, and the cycle deepened. So Alexei's illness didn't just make the royal family anxious, it tilted the balance of power in the empire. It gave Rasputin a foothold. It eroded trust in the monarchy, and it fueled whispers that the dynasty was cursed, unfit to rule, or simply out of touch with reality. Of course, we know how the story ends. The Russian Revolution came, the Romanovs were overthrown, and in 1918, the entire family was executed in a basement in Ukhat-Krunbug. Alexei was only 13, still fragile, still sick, still caught in the impossible role of being both a child and the embodiment of a dynasty's future. And here, the haunting thought. If Alexei hadn't had Hummerfalaya, if he'd been strong, healthy, capable, maybe Rasputin wouldn't have risen. Maybe Alexandra wouldn't have lost so much credibility. Maybe the monarchy could have limped on longer. But genetics had other plans. So once again, we see the quiet power of inheritance, not just crowns and palaces, but illnesses, weaknesses, fragility passed down like jewels. It's strange, isn't it, that the fate of an empire can rest on the blood clotting, or not clotting, inside the body of one little boy. Take a slow breath. Imagine the candlelit corridors of the Winter Palace, the sound of footsteps on marble, the silence of a sick room where a child lies pale in bed while his mother whispers prayers and a bearded mystic promises everything will be all right. That's the Romanovs. That's how dynasties end, not always with wars and battles, but with something as quiet as blood that won't heal. So we've seen what hemophilia did to the Romanovs in Russia. But Victoria's genetic legacy didn't stop there. Nope. It also landed squarely in Spain, where the Bourbon dynasty had enough problems already: political instability, coups, abdications, and now, thanks to a certain queen in Britain, they had fragile heirs too. The gene entered Spain through Victoria's daughter Beatrice. Beatrice married Prince Henry of Battenberg, and one of their daughters, Victoria Eugenie, nicknamed Ina, went on to marry King Alfonso XIII of Spain. It looked like a solid match at first. A respectable British princess marries into a European throne, standard dynastic business. Everyone clapped politely. But the catch, Ina carried hemophilia, and no one in Spain seemed to realize, or maybe they just didn't want to think about it. When Ina and Alfonso had children, the truth came out fast. Their sons, several of them were hemophiliacs, which in royal terms was a disaster. Let's picture the scene. It's the early 1900s. Spain is already politically shaky. Alfonso isn't exactly popular, and now every time the crown prince scrapes his knee, there's panic in the palace. Alfonso reportedly grew bitter toward Ina. He even blamed her personally for bringing the disease into the dynasty, which is unfair, but also very on brand for royal husbands. Their marriage grew cold, the court grew uneasy, and the Spanish monarchy, which had already lost much of its empire, now looked cursed from the inside. One of the most tragic cases was Prince Gonzalo, one of Ina's younger sons. He had hemophilia and lived under constant restrictions. But in 1934, at just 19 years old, he was in a minor car accident. At first, he seemed fine, just some bruises, but the internal bleeding wouldn't stop. Within days, he was dead. A small crash, a small injury, enough to end a prince's life. And it all traced back to one gene, passed quietly down from Queen Victoria. The Spanish Bourbons, of course, didn't disappear entirely. They were dethroned, then restored, then exiled, then restored again, because Spain likes to keep things dramatic. But the image of a fragile dynasty, weighed down by bleeding heirs, stuck in the public imagination. And poor Ina, who had come to Spain as a glowing young bride, spent much of her life blamed, isolated, and quietly tragic. She lived until 1969, long enough to see her grandchildren grow, and long enough to know exactly what her marriage and her genes had cost the Spanish throne. So there we have it, another crown, another dynasty, tilted by a single mutation. England, Russia, Spain, three great monarchies, all touched by the same invisible thread, weaving weakness into their futures. And if you think that's the end of Victoria's genetic reach, not quite. Because next, we drift into Germany. The Kaisers, the Prussian heirs, and the ways Victoria's bloodline linked even into the wars of the 20th century. But let's move slowly. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the sun on Spanish tiles, the shadow of a palace courtyard, and a child running carefully, too carefully, because even a fall could mean disaster. That's how fragile a dynasty can be. So we've looked at Russia, we've looked at Spain. But you know Victoria wasn't about to skip Germany. After all, half her family seemed to marry Germans. It was practically her favorite pastime. And the result, the German Empire ended up with its own royal quirks, courtesy of the British Queen. Let's meet Kaiser Wilhelm II, grandson of Queen Victoria, last German emperor, famous for his bombastic speeches, his fancy uniforms, and well, his arm. Wilhelm was born in 1859 with a difficult breech delivery. The birth injured his left arm. Some sources say nerve damage, others say Ubb's palsy. Either way, his arm was permanently weak and about 6 inches shorter than the right. Now, in a normal family, this might have just been a sad footnote. But in a royal dynasty obsessed with appearances and military glory, it was a source of deep insecurity. Young Wilhelm was forced through all kinds of painful therapies, electric shocks, stretching devices, even being forced to ride horses when he was barely able to hold the reins. Spoiler, none of it fixed his arm. And the psychological toll, immense. Wilhelm grew up feeling inadequate, angry, desperate to prove himself, which, as you might guess, didn't make him the most balanced future emperor. His grandmother, Queen Victoria, adored him at times, but also scolded him mercilessly. She wanted her grandson to be dignified, polished, the perfect image of royal masculinity. Instead, Wilhelm grew louder, brasher, more insecure by the year. By the time he became Kaiser in 1888, he had a complex the size of the Brandenburg Gate, obsessed with military parades, desperate to outshine Britain, constantly trying to prove Germany was just as important, if not more so, than his grandmother's empire. And all of this, the arm, the insecurities, the rivalry, fed into the tensions that eventually exploded into World War I. So yes, one difficult birth injury helped shape not only a man, but the fate of Europe. But Victoria's German descendants didn't just bring personality problems, they also carried that Hummerfollower gene. Her daughter Princess Alice, Victoria's second daughter, married into the German Hessian line. She passed Hummerfollower to her children. Her daughter Alax, later known as Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, was the one who carried it into the Romanovs. So really, Germany was a central hub in the spread of the royal disease. From Hesse to Russia to Spain, it all flowed outward. And the irony, Queen Victoria had wanted peace in Europe, secured by her children marrying across the continent. Instead, her genetic legacy helped destabilize half the crowned heads she so carefully arranged. Wilhelm II himself didn't have Hummerfollower. He had plenty of other problems, but not that one. Still, his reign shows how even when it wasn't genetics, it was still health, still the body that shaped monarchy. A weak arm created a fragile ego created a restless empire, and a restless empire, well, you know how that story ends. Picture it, the Kaiser, striding around in his elaborate uniforms, his withered arm tucked carefully behind his back, determined to look every inch the strong ruler. And yet inside, the same old doubts whispered. That's the quiet heartbeat of dynastic history, what the portraits don't show, but what shaped the world anyway.